Hello my lovely little meat popsicles and welcome back. You're tuned in to another exciting broadcast here on WRPG Radio, the only channel on the airwaves threatening you with a great time. Just don't read the terms and conditions very hard. Since our last 3 videos shared a lot about the underlying fabric of Grim Dawn, namely how you'll survive and how you'll fight back against the ever-growing legions of post-apocalyptic nightmare fuel spilling in from the other side of reality, we're going to take a bit more of a nebulous approach with this video and talk about something a bit harder to nail down. Most of the time when you start up a new game, there are so many systems and tutorials involved that it can be downright daunting to invest your time in something when you have to spend so much of it just putting the pieces together. For the sake of those people out there who have trouble making decisions when you're starting a new game, this video will be all about putting on those proverbial blinders and giving you a few things to focus on while you unravel the game for yourself. You have your handy study guides for damage and defense already, so you can make some informed choices about how you'd like your character to play. What you might not know is how to go about funneling your vision for yourself into the ever-expanding world of Cairn. Grim Dawn is split up into a total of 7 acts depending on which expansions you have. At this point, I don't think playing the game without all the expansions is nearly as much fun, but if you're on a budget, getting them one at a time is still an option. We'll talk about each of those acts a little later since we have to start out in our abandoned prison turned emergency shelter, Devil's Crossing. As you finish the opening cutscene while simultaneously losing all of your memory, you're introduced to the first town and faction in Grim Dawn. Towns will essentially be your hubs for buying and selling gear, storing extra loot, picking up and completing quests, plenty of good sources of lore, and a very important vendor known as the Quartermaster. The Quartermaster is a special vendor that appears in larger towns who gives you access to a faction's special equipment. Factions in Grim Dawn are groups of characters who are aligned behind a specific ideology or purpose. The more quests you complete or enemies of that faction that you kill, the more reputation you'll gain with them. The more reputation you gain, the more access you have in the Quartermaster's shop. Each tier in the shop has more and more useful items, so you'll want to keep those reputation meters in mind. On the other hand, there are also enemy factions whose meter gain unlocks more powerful enemies. As you gain infamy with the enemy factions, more enemy heroes will spawn all the way up to special bosses called nemesis bosses that will appear in the world and absolutely wreck your entire life if you aren't prepared for them. We'll talk more about the different factions of friendlies and enemies in future videos, but remember that the meters you fill for each of them are very important and will get more important as you get higher in level and difficulty. Besides the Quartermaster, you've also got to talk to other static vendors in town. We'll start with an easy one, which is going to be your Smuggler. This is just a fancy title for your loot stash. The stash in Grim Dawn is interesting for a couple of reasons. Firstly, remember that you can auto-sort your stash when it's getting full, though the game will mostly sort by size, not necessarily by any meaningful metrics. Second, you can automatically pull all of your components from your inventory and drop them into a stash tab. I recommend putting them in a shared stash tab since they have universal use cases. We're gonna stop on components right there, but remember, I said shared stash tabs. You get 6 tabs on every character, and then there are 6 more tabs that all of your characters share. If you're playing hardcore, these shared tabs only connect with other hardcore characters, so should you decide to start your very first hardcore character, you'll pretty much be starting all the way over. Also, you'll have to buy each of these new stash tabs at increasing levels of iron, so make sure you have enough when you are running out of space. Don't feel like you have to save everything that you pick up. Most towns also have a blacksmith, who is a pretty complex vendor, but the nice thing about the blacksmith is that each of them has a built-in set of stats that they'll add to your gear when you craft with them. For example, Duncan, the Devil's Crossing blacksmith, can give you energy regen, defensive ability, or percent physique. The other blacksmiths have their own stats to roll on gear, so be sure to check them all out and get the right stats for the gear that you want. You might also find blacksmiths out in the world like Horus, the cursed smith near the gates of Necropolis, and they have special smithing options to smith special crafting items, special materials, in addition to adding on extra stats for gear. You may also find things called blueprints when you're out in the world, which are just plans for special gear. These plans are shared the same way stash tabs are, so the more blueprints you have, the more characters you have benefiting from some really unique items. While not all towns have a blacksmith, even fewer have an inventor. The inventor is the vendor that's going to be doing all of your special gear handling that doesn't involve crafting it. The caveat to this is that you have to undergo a number of quests to unlock all of the inventor skills if you haven't purchased the Crucible DLC. Speaking of the inventor skills, it might be a good idea to actually talk about them since they're pretty important. The first is how you're going to keep your important items and components while you find new gear, and that's called salvaging. When you salvage, you'll either destroy the item or destroy the component that is attached to it. Whichever you choose, you'll keep the other, so the early game you'll probably salvage more components, but the late game you'll get some that are very hard to craft and you'll want to keep those components instead. You can also remove augment from item this way and keep both the item and the component. Remember that you can't put an item with an augment in your shared box, so you'll need to remove it if you want to share it with other characters. The next skill the inventor has is called Dismantle, and this one is a lot simpler while also being a bit of a gamble. When you dismantle an item, you're going to spend some dynamite to blow up the item and turn it into some special materials. You'll usually get some scrap and either a component or a unique material, depending on the rarity of the gear that you dismantle. Dismantling anything less than epic gear might have some diminishing returns, but don't be afraid to dynamite those blues and purples that you have tons of duplicates for. You can get some easy brain matter or ancient hearts without having to do all the crazy grinding that you're used to, and who doesn't love a delicious brain or heart to go with dinner? The final skill for the inventor is probably the highest gamble, but also the highest possible reward. Once you make it into Ultimate, you're going to start finding legendary sets. Sometimes you'll get sets quickly, and all the pieces just seem to happily drop into your lap. Some other times, however, you'll be spending literal weeks looking for the final piece of a set, only to have 15 copies of the exact same useless shoulder piece. It's at this point you'll want to collect some Eldritch Essence from Act 7, a ridiculous amount of money, and bring one of your useless armor pieces to the inventor. You'll throw all of these into the transmute box, and the game will re-roll the item to a different part of the same set. The gambly part of this is that it can roll right back into that useless piece if you roll it a second time. It's very easy to get frustrated and re-roll yourself into 0 money, 0 materials, and the same terrible gear that you started with, especially if you're only missing one piece of a set and have plenty of the others to go around. You can also change a set piece into an item from a different set this way, but that's always going to be a bit of a shot in the dark and something to do only if you're interested in getting rid of some more common legendaries you find. I'd also recommend this if you only play one character or are starting out for the first time in Ultimate and collecting legendaries slowly. Transmuting to another set can be really useful for finding new things and inspiring yourself to build new characters. Like I said earlier, you'll unlock the second and third skills for the inventor through a couple of side quests. The first comes from Devil's Crossing, specifically Kasparov will give this one to you, and you'll get that after reaching respected status with Devil's Crossing. Starting out in Act 2 is when you'll pick up this quest, typically with that reputation meter getting up there. Basically, you'll get him some dynamite, and Darlet, the actual inventor, will get the dismantle. For transmutation, you'll need to speak with Kargon, and he is in Act 7. Why is there so much time between these two things? Well, probably because transmuting is a bit more of a late game skill, but still it's easy to forget that you'll need to unlock this, so don't forget to talk to the inventor in the Conclave of the Three and pick up the Tome of Enotum quest. This unlocks for a bit of playtime in the act, so make sure that you don't miss out. Town is definitely full of things to buy, quests to collect, and different fashion styles to try on, but there is a vendor in town whose whole purpose is to help you correct the mistakes along your build path. More than that, they can help you change your devotion paths when you box yourself into a corner, checking out interesting new passives through your devotion menu. The Spirit Guide is all about taking your money and your Aether Crystals and turning them into a very handy undo button. This vendor will take any points you've allocated to a specific skill and will take them out for you to pool up or change to a different skill entirely. If you feel like you don't have enough damage, maybe you'll pull some points out of one of your defensive skills to give you that boost. Or maybe your soldier class is being a bit of a point hog and you want to share some of that attention with your demolitionist. The possibilities are as deep as your wallet and material bucket can go. In other words, your Spirit Guide is your respec vendor for all of you action RPG aficionados out there. This is the one that you'll need to talk to. One more important thing to remember is that there are only 5 Spirit Guides in the game, but one of them dies and the other one is locked behind the Crucible DLC, so effectively there are only 3. Up until the Ashes of Malmeth, you'll have the Spirit Guide in Devil's Crossing. This is Sedina, and until Act 5, she's going to be your only one. After that, you'll have access to the guide in Coven's Refuge, and further beyond that, you can find another guide in the Steelcap district of Malmeth. Once Act 5 has started, Sedina will be gone, and you'll need to use these 2 or start Act 7 and find the guide in the Conclave of the 3. The last vendor to mention in town is your plain old gear seller. For those of us who are starting a new character, these guys will be a treasure trove all their own for immediate gear upgrades in the first 40-ish levels. They also sell anything from melee and ranged weapons to all different kinds of armor and components. It's always a good idea to check these guys out when you get to a new town because more often than not, they'll have at least 1 or 2 things that will be an upgrade to gear you've picked up thus far. Once you get close to level 50 and further, you'll probably use these guys more for selling than buying though. Similar to the blacksmiths, you can find secret vendors out in the world who sell special gear like monster infrequents and blueprints. You'll be able to find these vendors in all of the roguelike dungeons too, so make sure that you can collect them all. Each is marked by a loot bag on the minimap, so one of them is a big happy plant named Vinylton, and if that doesn't just beat all of the others, I don't think we know what we're really doing here. There is one more vendor in town actually, but given that this vendor is the whole reason I even care to play some of my characters, I saved them for the super secret final slot. Known as the Illusionist, this is going to be your transmog vendor. Obviously, you'll have to go out into the world and pick up the transmogs that you want, but this vendor stores them across all of your characters, and then you pay to customize your fashion. This kind of cosmetic change is so important for these kind of games, it's basically a death sentence not to have one, at least in my opinion. If I can't take my character and make it cool looking, then I can promise you I probably won't be playing it. And if I'm not playing the character, it's pretty likely I'm going to get bored and stop playing whatever game we're talking about, period. The Illusionist will let you change everything from your head to your metal and will have all of your DLC transmog purchases as well right from the start. So if you bought the cosmetic packs like I did, that's where they're all hiding. Now remember, just because all of the vendors are checked off the list, that doesn't mean that the towns don't have other useful things to do. As a matter of fact, you'll be getting the vast majority of your quests in town, so make sure that you talk to all the NPCs as often as possible. You'll want to pick up every quest, especially on your first playthrough, because the quest XP that you get in Grimdawn will catapult you into higher levels faster than most other options. This gets even better with certain XP farming gear and a potion of clarity, but I'll talk about those 2 things in another video about starting new characters. On top of quests, however, there is another way to collect quest XP from towns if you've already finished all of the NPC quests for your storyline. Each town that has a faction headquartered there will have access to the bounty table. The bounty table is a mechanic specific to each faction and comes with quests specific to that faction. These bounties usually result in some kind of gathering mission or hunting down a certain enemy, but always result in some pretty good XP gains, and more importantly, they give you increased reputation with the faction you're working at the moment. Remember, more reputation means more access to things in the Quartermaster shop. The Quartermaster has some really great items, and particularly once you've made it into Ultimate, you'll want to have all the Quartermasters up to the Revered status as soon as possible. The Revered tab is where you'll be getting all of your augments and legendary blueprints. Long story short, if you feel like you've hit a wall, farm up some reputation at the bounty table. You'll get more XP, you'll get more rep, and you won't have to slam your head against the wall against enemies that might be giving you a rough go of it. Speaking of hitting walls, I do want to talk about the general layout of the story and how far you'll go in the game as you progress, because there is some good information in the very basic understanding of going from point A to point B. Point A being the beginning, and point B being the finale. Grimdawn is split up into acts when it comes to its story, and these acts dictate the pace of the game, as well as enemy types, quest XP amounts, and plenty other things. Unlike most action RPGs, Grimdawn has 7 acts to play through once you've gotten Ashes of Malmeth and Forgotten Gods expansions. Now, it'll be 8 or maybe 9 once Fangs of Astrakarn comes out, so that being said, I'm going to lay them out quickly since you may not actually notice through the game when the acts change from one to another. Cairn is the overworld in which all of Grimdawn takes place. When you open up your map, you're looking at all the different regions that make up the continent, with a few new ones on the way in the new expansion. If you only have the base game of Grimdawn, you'll have access to the lower region of Berwick, which is a small coastal township, and that has been invaded and conquered by the Ethereals. Berwick will account for your entire Act 1, and your main town hub for Act 1 will be Devil's Crossing, which, let's face it, might end up being your main town hub for a lot of the game anyway, since it's all really nicely contained. After that, you'll make your way east towards the ancient catastrophe known as Arkovia. This is a land of ruins and cataclysm long past, full of bandits hiding from the last scraps of humanity, along with the roaming undead as they wander their once vibrant city, cursed never to die as the world forgets more and more about them each day. Act 2 will have you hunting down the big bad bandit leader Cronley and heading into the Arkovian Undercity. The main town hub for Act 2 is going to be the Rover Camp in Old Arkovia, which is where you'll find the Rover's Quartermaster. After you've done all the tomb raiding your heart can handle in Act 2, you'll make your way further up the eastern side of the world, venturing into a veritable no man's land called Jagged Waste. Once you've finished with the Undercity and make your way to Smuggler's Pass, you're in Act 3. Act 3's main town hub is Homestead, and this is probably the only other town hub that competes with Devil's Crossing in coziness factor. Homestead has access to 3 different quartermasters, actually, so this is a great option if you're looking for a place to farm rep for efficiency's sake. You'll have the Homestead, the Black Legion, and either the Death's Vigil or Kaiman's Chosen Quartermaster here. The last one just depends on which faction you choose to help, but that's always up to you. You can also find both of these factions' actual bases of operation further up in Sorrow's Bastion, but once you've done all the quests for them, you don't have much reason to keep going into their bases, apart from the shop that is, which is now conveniently located in Homestead. Act 3 ends with a big boss fight inside a mountain stronghold which will spit you out into the cold, unforgiving wilderness of Astrakarn. This is the start of Act 4 and likely will be your anchor point for the new expansion since the region is right there in the title. You'll have to fight your way forward for a bit to get to the next town, however, and let me tell you, this is usually where I start running out of steam first. For some reason, the road to Fort Icon is just my least favorite stretch of the game, despite having some really cool hidden stuff to discover. Fort Icon is your town for Act 4 and has the Black Legion Quartermaster again. Act 4 is the final act in the base game as well, so remember that if you don't have the expansions, you won't be going any further than this in the story once you're done. That shouldn't stop you from starting on a new difficulty, but again, buy the expansions. It's worth it. Act 5 is the beginning of the Ashes of Malmouth expansion. You'll start by heading back to Burwich and breaking down a big green crystal barrier. The barrier leads into the swampy, cannibal-infested lowlands of Gloomwald and Ugdenbog. After a bit of traversal, you'll make your way to the Act 5 town called Coven's Refuge. This is where all the witches of Cairn are gathered and has your new spirit guide, an illusionist, and a very good quartermaster. The only thing I think that prevents this town from being the new Devil's Crossing is the fact that it does not have a blacksmith. So other than that mortal disappointment, this place is pretty great. Act 5 is full of beast enemies and Chthonians right before Act 6, and it also sports a smaller faction that you'll have the option to align with or be hostile towards, but that's something you'll find out on your own. Act 6 takes place as you begin to enter Malmouth proper and has nothing but mountains of ethereal enemies to take on. There are small instances of Chthonians and undead running about, but this is your ethereal vengeance story on a silver platter. Act 6 also has what can be considered the best town of all if it weren't so late in the game and having a few vendors locked behind side quests. If it weren't for that simple fact, I'd likely spend all of my time in the Steelcap district since it has a blacksmith, an inventor, and a spirit guide for all of my build crafting needs. The fact that these need to be re-obtained every new difficulty is another headache, but if you're the type of person who likes to play a single character for a while, I would certainly consider this, or the Act 7 town, a permanent hub. Speaking of Act 7, that's where we'll be ending this video. Act 7 is technically available from the very start of the game, so if you'd like to open up that portal, you can start fighting beasts, eldritch enemies, and Kaiman's Chosen much earlier than you might be ready for them. This town holds all of the vendors and 3 different quartermasters for the 3 different witch god cults. Don't worry about selecting one over the other when deciding which god to align with. The missions you're provided with will change, but you can still access all of the quartermasters at the same time. One of them will just gather reputation a little bit faster than the others. That, however, is everything you need to know to get started on your first time playing Grim Dawn. This should get you enough information to make it up and down the entire campaign, doing all the sightseeing and gear grinding your tiny little human blood pumper can handle. So ta-ta for now, and until next time, keep it tuned in to WRPG Radio.
Or else.